Good afternoon. My name is Anthony Bogues, the Professor of Africana Studies and Director of the newly inaugurated Center for the Study of Slavery and Justice. And I want to welcome you to this talk. I would like to begin my remarks by talking about two writers, the French thinker and author of that remarkable text written in the 19th century, Democracy in America, Alex de Tocqueville. The second writer I would like to talk about is perhaps the most significant African-American intellectual of the 20th century, W.E.B. Du Bois. So let's begin with de Tocqueville. The year is 1848, and in his preface to the 12th edition of Democracy in America, de Tocqueville, thinking about the question of equality, poses this business of equality in a period of tumultuous events in Paris and Europe, 1848. This is what de Tocqueville says. Now, this problem, referring to the problem of equality, newly posed for us, meaning Europe, was solved in America 60 years ago. For 60 years, de Tocqueville continues, the principle of the sovereignty of the people has prevailed unchallenged there. End of quote. De Tocqueville calls upon the French people, and indeed upon all Europe, not to copy America, but to understand two political principles, political equality and forms of representative democracy. For de Tocqueville, though, the principle of sovereignty excludes the indigenous population, the Native Americans, and the African slave. Because for de Tocqueville, the slaves, and here I quote him, had a separate destiny than that of white America. In chapter 10 of the first volume of Democracy in America, he notes, the Negro, and here I quote him, hardly notices his ill fortune. He is reduced to slavery by violence and by the habit of servitude, which has given him the thoughts and the ambitions of a slave, he continues. De Tocqueville says, he admires, meaning the slave, admires his tyrants even more than he hates them, and finds his, that is the slave, joy and his pride in a servile imitation of his oppressors. End of quote. Slavery, de Tocqueville note then, is about oppression. But in the case of the African American in the United States, or the black slave in America, the black slave is a slave because he's a natural slave. So the business of being oppressed does not apply to him or her since he enjoys being a natural slave. He ends this particular chapter this way. A freedom, de Tocqueville says, is refused to the Negroes in the South. In the end, they will seize it themselves. If it is granted to them, he says, they will not be slow to abuse it. So that even if they get freedom, he would want to argue, they will abuse it. What we have here, therefore, is in an early political account of America, a position formulated in which slavery is marginal to the American Republic. Slavery then is not seen as shaping the form of democracy, nor of rights and political equality. So here we have, in the very foundational reflections of the American Republic, the disentanglement between slavery, democracy, rights, and the American Republic. I would want to suggest to you that this separation, This distance between slavery and the architecture of the political realities and frame of the American Republic then becomes a platform, the ground on which hegemonic social historical consciousness, that is the dominant consciousness that we have about our history, emerges and then grows. Let me turn to W.E.B. Du Bois. The text is perhaps the most important historical text written in the English language in the first half of the 20th century. The title of the text is Black Reconstruction in America, 1860 to 1880, and it is written in 1935. The subtitle of the text is important. It says, An Essay Towards a History of the Past, which black folk played in an attempt to reconstruct democracy in America, 1860 to 1880. For Du Bois, therefore, Black Reconstruction is really about black folks and the central role that they played in reconstruction democracy after the United States Civil War. The creation of democracy, therefore, includes ex-slaves. But more importantly for Du Bois, the ex-slaves helped to shape the character of that democracy. This is how he puts it in the first chapter of Black Reconstruction. And here I quote him. How black men coming to America in the 16th, 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries became a central thread in the history of the United States, at once a challenge to its democracy, and always an important part of its economic history and social development. What we have here are two views of American history. Political equality, in which there's no need for the Native American and the black slave, and another view of American history in which the questions of democracy, equality, and justice are critical, indeed central, to racial slavery and therefore to the black population. We are talking about history, American history specifically in this case. But I want to pause for a moment to tease out this business of history and its possibly meanings for us. When one says history, immediately one thinks of the past. That is, history as the past. It seems that history is about a time gone, one never to return. There is, if you wish, a kind of peculiar temporality to the past, so much so that one historical thinker has called the past, and here I quote him, empty time. Often we see the past as strictly differentiated from the present, only at best having some kind of civic function. From the very first United States history books, ones that began in 1794, written by Mr. Noah Webster, titled An American Selection of Lessons in Reading and Speaking, or Mr. John McCulloch's A Concise History of the United States from Discovery of America until 1795, published in 1795, the function of history was to be a teacher of the nation. This was codified in the 1911 report of the American Historical Society, which quotes the following: American history, it says, is the most immediate subject for preparing boys and girls for citizenship. End of quote. A history, therefore, was to teach a past in which the knowledge of the past was to consolidate a set of dominant ideas about the character of America. But what are these dominant ideas about the character of America? Let us look at three texts very quickly. One written in 1889, one in 1933, and one written in 1950. In the 1889 text, which became very popular both at universities and then was reproduced in some form for high schools, this is what we see them saying about Negroes, what they called Negro slavery. Negro slavery, the text says, in the colonies was one of those cases in which there was worst bad judgment. So that slavery becomes something about bad judgment. And I thought it's important to show you, this is 1889. This is a painting that was done in 1880, around 1880. It's supposed to be the last sale of slaves in St. Louis. And what I thought that it might be important to show you that this sale happened, or the artist renditions of it, but this was considered to be just a case of bad judgment. 1933, this is what the history text says. Although he was in a state of slavery, the Negro on the plantation was unusually happy. He was fond of company and liked to sing. And this is the most popular artistic rendition of slaves on American plantation, called The Old Plantation. We have no idea, and there's a big debate about who painted it, but this has become the kind of standard image that people see when people think about the American plantation. But you can see it reflects the actual the text in 1933. The Negro is very happy, and he likes the company of others, and he loves to sing. 1950, this is what the history text says. Yet life in the slave quarters and many plantations was happy. So here we have a set of historical texts from the end of the Civil War right up until 1950 that really argues that slavery was bad judgment, that these were happy slaves, and that I would argue that these were ideas which were dominant about racial slavery in America. What is the point here? The point here is that history is really about the knowledge of the past. That history is not the past, but really about the knowledge of the past. That the knowledge of that past is often shaped by the particular concerns that we have in the present. So in the present, in 1890s, people were thinking about what it is that the people were on the plantation, what did they do, how did they feel, but they had a certain view of the so-called Negro at that point. Thirdly, that this past, or I would argue any past, is temporarily detached and somehow different from the present. But I would want to argue differently. But that rather than the past being detached and temporarily different from the present, that it is actually connected to the present. Historical knowledge, I would want to suggest to you, attempts to be a form of reasoning which seeks to rationalize the relationships between past and present. If the past, but I would want to suggest to you that the past leaves traces, that it creates sedimented deposits, which then creates and constructs a new yet old ground on which we begin our lives over and over again. The past, therefore, produces a certain kinds of deposits, and that these deposits, if you wish, become inscribed within our so-called choices, and therefore means that our choices have a past. So you may say to me, we cannot therefore act outside of the constraints of this past. And my response to you would be both yes and no. Let's go back to the Tocqueville. His view of America means that we have a dominant set of ideas and culture in which black folks are always outside looking in. That the black population is marginal, not because of history or past structures, but because the black folks themselves cannot help it. There may be, of course, exceptions. And there is something that is called the exceptional Negro. And President Obama would be an exception. That is, you go to the right schools, you do the right things, and then you are part of the society. But in this case, I would want to suggest to you that the exception proves the rule. Slavery was, in this view, therefore, just bad judgment. there is no need to confront it. Racism and structural racism is simply, in this view, about individual prejudice. There is no need to confront it, particularly after the civil rights movement and the laws of 1964 and 65. In all of this view, one is reminded of a comment by the African-American writer Jimmy Baldwin in 1962 in his essay, The Fire Next Time, where he says, and here I quote him, that the country, meaning the United States of America, is celebrating 100 years of freedom. And Jimmy says, 100 years too soon. Such a view, therefore, of slavery as bad judgment, a view of racism as individual prejudice, sees the past as dead, understands historical knowledge as narratives of rationalization, and therefore is unable to grapple with our present. And in unable to grapple in our present, it means that it is unable to understand events of Baltimore or the events of Ferguson. In such a view of history, I would want to suggest to you, we are hobbled by history rather than history serving as a form of release. In a culture in which questions of redemption and the capacity to rewrite oneself is deeply valued, this view of history means that we are not able to confront the past and the way in which the past works inside our present and helps to shape our future. It is, in my view, a view of history that serves a narrow civic function. What this view also means is that any change that we would desire, we desire it at a level of incrementality. That is, it happens slowly. So the wheels of justice turn slowly and ever so slowly. But as Martin Luther King in 1963 remarked to the white liberal clergy when he was Birmingham jail, and when they asked him to wait and to hold on so that the wheel of justice could move slowly, this is what he says. "We are caught," Martin Luther King said, "in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. I am sure that each of you would want to go beyond," and this is what I think is important, "the superficial social analysis of effects and grapple with the underlying causes." The issue, therefore, is how to grapple with the underlying causes of our present. And in trying to grapple with that, I would want to suggest to you that a particular view of history becomes important. So, what if we had, therefore, the other view of history, of the American past, the one in which Du Bois suggested to us, the one in which he says that the black population challenges American democracy and are a central thread. If we have this view, I would want to suggest that history does not therefore become a constraint, but that it becomes a way to interpret the past that may give us the tools and the ground to actually confront the present. What it means is that we need to look at history and its complexities squarely, or the past, and its complexities squarely in the face. We need to say that slavery was central to the business of the American Republic, both North and South, that it was not an afterthought or bad judgment, that it was a unique form of slavery based on race, not on religion, that in this form of slavery, race then becomes a living principle of ways of life of the American Republic and representative democracy. And that as we do this, then we begin to understand that that principle of race structures ways of life, structures economics, structures politics, and structures how we actually live with each other. Race, therefore, and the history of slavery and racial slavery has created in this country what Professor Augusto calls parallel lives. So the long arc of the past leaves deposits, and it leaves deposits within the pores of our republic, and creates an insidious form of oppression, anti-black racism. Du Bois understood this very well, and in a remarkable bibliographic section of the Black Reconstruction, he constructs it in a certain way which is just remarkable. The bibliography says historians who have a standard or anti-Negro view, then historians who are fair to indifferent to the Negro, and then he has Negro historians. In other words, what is fascinating is the way he's telling us historical story, but also doing a bibliography, which is key for every historical book, to say these are the ways in which people actually think about this, the African American. I would want to suggest to you that one way of trying to think about this business of slavery, of grappling with it at the level of history, but also of grappling with it at the level of ethics and morality, and particularly ethics, that it may be useful to go back to the concluding thoughts of the report of the Slavery and Justice Committee. And this is what the report, this part, the concluding part of the concluding thoughts say. American slavery and the transatlantic slave trade were crimes against humanity. Indeed, they were the very definition of such crimes, offenses that in their denial of the shared humanity of certain categories of people diminish the humanity of all people, whether victims, perpetrators, or bystanders. The familiar extensions or enunciations that slavery and the slave trading were at once legal, that they ended a long time ago, that direct victims and perpetrators are long since dead, that many, even most Americans are themselves descendants of immigrants who came to America after 1885, are all true. But they neither expunge the crimes nor erase their enduring legacies. In labeling slavery and the slave trade as a crime against humanity, we are not merely indulging in hindsight or projecting our present values back to the past. While the international legal regimes for responding to crimes against humanity was codified only in the 20th century, the concepts that undergird it, the basic institutions about and intuitions about shared nature of humanity and the irreducible moral worth of all human beings come to us directly from the 18th century. In other words, what we try to argue in this report was that there is a way in which when people say, okay, it's not a crime because it was legal, all the laws of the states and the customs and so on said, yes, you could own a slave, and there were codes for treating slaves and so on, that may be true. But there was also another alternative set of thinkings at that very same moment, which argued that this was wrong. And so that therefore the argument that somehow all of this is because it's history and that it's a question of the times does not hold water in our view. Grappling with this particular fact that the slavery in this country and in the Americas was a crime against humanity requires us to do the following things. Firstly, to rewrite the historical knowledges of the American past, to rewrite it not as a sordid affair, but one which had a complex relationship between unfreedom and freedom, and to think about how unfreedom shaped our notions of freedom and how it actually shapes our historical imagination. This, in fact, might allow us to begin to rethink this notion of American exceptionalism. Secondly, thinking about slavery in the way I've just suggested and was suggested by the Brown Report calls us to grapple with the unfinished business of the deposits, of the ways of life in which if we do not confront the structures of society, we may find them haunting us as specters, and not just as ghosts, but as real specters later on. What de Tocqueville did not say was that at the core of the dominant American thought was the idea of competitive individualism, dramatized, I would argue, in the work of the famous American political theorist Lewis Harris, who argued that American individualism was about, competitive individualism was, he says, about the race of life. I quote him. Grappling with racial slavery and its historic meanings and the memories of slavery in our country would allow us to focus on structures, will allow us to focus on forms of associations, not on the race of life. I want to end with poetry and some lines from the African-American poet Langston Hughes. And the poem, written in 1938, is called Let America Be America Again. And this is what he says. Let America be the dream the dreamers dreamed. Let it be that great, strong land of love, where never kings connive nor tyrants scheme, that any man be crushed by anyone above. And then he says, I never was America to me. He says, oh, let my land be a land where liberty is crowned with no false patriotic wreath, but opportunity is real and life is free. Equality is the air we breathe. Then he says, there never been equality for me, nor freedom in this homeland of the free. I am, Langston says, the poor white fooled and pushed apart. I am the Negro bearing slavery scars. I am the red man driven from the land. I am the immigrant clutching the hope I seek and finding only the same old stupid plan of dog eat dog, of mighty crush the weak. I am the old man, he says, full of strength and hope, tangled in that ancient endless chain of profit, power, gain, of garnished land, of grab the land, of grab the gold, of grab the ways of satisfying need, of work the men, of take the pay, of owning everything for one's own greed. Who said the free? Not me. Surely not me. The millions on relief today, the millions shut down when we strike, the millions who have nothing for our pay, for all the dreams we have dreamed, and all the songs we sung, and all the hopes we held, and all the flags we hung, the millions who have nothing for our pay except the dream that is almost dead today. Oh, let America be America again, the land that never has been yet, and yet must be, the land where every man is free, the land that's mine, the poor man's, the Indian, the Negro, me. Who made America? Whose sweat and blood, whose faith and pain, whose hands at the foundry, whose plow in the rain, must bring me back our mighty dream again. The work of the Center for the Study of Slavery and Justice is about bringing back that mighty dream. Thank you very much. Questions, comments?
So I'll try.
Yes, please, sir.
Being a bit of a history buff myself, not just American history, going way back in time, slavery was a condition for before history. Before history. Whether it was the Greeks to the Romans, the Greeks to their neighbors, the Saracens and the Turks, the North Africans, taking European slaves, and doubtless many other parts of the world. Has there been that context taken into the overall context of American slavery and an understanding of how other peoples have slowly incorporated and the history of assimilations of prior slaves.
Yeah, there are two really very important texts. One is of English historian who came here to live. His name is Moses Finley, and the book is called Ideology of Slavery. And one of the things that Moses argues, and I think successfully so, is that there is a way in which the ideas of slavery developed in Greek and Roman society find themselves in United States and are readapted and reworked to justify African slavery. So that there is a way in which, therefore, in the 1600s and 1700s, once slavery begins to be instituted formally in this country and the move from indentured servitude, then what happens is that people reach back to the old text, and this is normal. You reach back to an old set of texts as a way to begin to think through and read and think about what is it that they are doing and how can they think through, how can they develop a set of ideas that justifies and rationalize what it is that they are actually doing. So that's the first thing. The second thing, though, is Jefferson's Notes on Virginia, in which Jefferson, as we know, is a founding father, but is also the owner of a plantation with slaves. And one of the things that Jefferson writes in Notes on Virginia is the following. He says, everybody, almost paraphrasing what you said, everybody had slaves. The Romans had slaves, etc., etc., he says, and so on. He says, but there's something distinctive about our slavery. He says the distinctiveness about our slavery is that we have the Negroes. And he says that what that means is that, in his view, is that to emancipate them is a problem. What is he talking about? What he's talking about is that the slavery in America becomes unique. Because in Roman times, in Greek times, in other civilizations and countries, once you had a slave, and Jefferson points this out in Notes on Virginia, once you were a slave, you could actually have the capacity and the ability to be manumitted and to move up in the society. Once you constructed in America, not just America, but the Americas, constructed slavery based on race, and the black skin then became a badge of slavery, then that slavery and being inferior was perpetual. And that is the difference. In other words, that the question of race as a way in which you can then put people in slavery becomes a cause, becomes a foundation, as an explanation for the inferiority of another human being, and for therefore a set of ideas to develop as to why you should enslave them. The skin, therefore, and this is what one of the reasons in my work why I've actually turned to the visual, is that one of the important things, therefore, to understand in human affairs is that the visual then becomes important. The visual itself produces knowledge. So you have a thing in your head that says, okay, blackness is not good and so on, or blackness means inferior. Once you see that person, what happens in your head? What kind of ideas do you bring to bear upon that particular relationship, or upon that particular individual or group of human beings that you are actually seeing? And that then becomes unique. That becomes unique, and that becomes unique from about the 1500s with the Spanish and a whole set of debates and so on, and then really becomes really very central to the Americas and to our modern notions of life and human beings. And that's the difference. And that's what makes the slavery in the Americas so distinct. Does that help, sir? Thank you.
Yes. You mentioned the visual. I've been looking at this image on the screen, and you read that as happy slaves on the plantation.
They call it old plantation, yes.
But it's also been used a lot to talk about African traditions surviving on the plantation. And those two sort of can exist together, but can be read in opposite ways. I just wonder if you could talk about that.
That's absolutely true, right? I think that, there is a way in which the images of slavery, and the paintings about slavery, actually paint the plantations as in with these long vistas, where you actually have to look up to the plantation. You have to kind of crook your neck a bit to be able to see the plantation. So the plantation becomes the gaze is one in which the plantation is absolutely supreme. This one is slightly different. This plantation is it's off in the distance. You don't have to kind of crick your neck. It is there. And what is interesting is that it foregrounds the actual slaves in their quote unquote quarters. Okay. Secondly, that it does not paint them in a way in which a lot of the paintings do at the time, where the actual slaves are dressed in absolute finery and doing kind of almost revelry, or you have paintings where the slaves are cut in canes, but they look like they're walking to church on a Sunday morning, right? So that there's this kind of difference. What some people have said is that what you have is particularly with the guy with the stick in the center, and the woman surrounding him, that what he's doing is a particular dance that comes from Africa with sticks, right, and called a part of what some people have seen as stick fighting. And then the fellow playing the banjo at the side there, right, is something obviously that comes from the New World. So that there's a way in which people say what you have is an image of portraying slaves in their quarters away from the master's gaze, doing things that the master does not quite understand. I think that's one reading, but I have a quarrel with that particular reading, because I think it also, one has to see it within the context of a certain set of paintings and a set of a genealogy of paintings at a specific moment, which paints the slaves in certain ways. Because this also can be read as the slaves are contented. They're contented. You meet and you have your dances and you play your music and you enjoy friends and so on and so forth. So what are you all complaining about, right? So that, and the argument about this painting is that whether or not it was actually painted by a planter or somebody who lived on a plantation. We're not quite sure who yet is, and there are lots of people who have written, in fact, 2 books have been written about who painted this, but I don't think there's any definitive answer. Certainly, empirical archival research that I have seen that proves it. But that's how I see it. But there's a way in which I think, Steve, that you can think about, okay, here are these slaves, this human population, this group of people who are enjoying themselves, who are trying to do things away from the master's gaze, and so what is the problem? What I think the question that one may want to ask is this, I think. If you put any group in bondage, any human group in bondage, then they are going to find ways, like the night follows the day, they are going to find ways in which they can express their own humanity. That does not mean they're not in bondage. What that means is that they are trying to find ways to see themselves as human beings. And that I think there's a certain desire and impulse in us as a human being, that no matter what happens, we try and find a way to see if we can, if we can express our humanity. And that is how I like to see. Not even as resistance, but as a way in which people trying to express their own humanity in a situation that is not good.
Could I challenge you?
Yeah, of course.
Is it unhelpful, in a sense, to look at American black slavery as especially unique versus looking at it as a variation upon slavery as a whole in the world? In the sense that if it's unique, then then one feels maybe a unique stigma, as opposed to being part of a world that had a fair amount of slavery. Even late in history. For all intents and purposes, the Sicilians and the Russians were slaves until the First World War, in each case. The Arabs continued holding slaves well into the 20th century. And my point not being that, I mean, slavery is but my point being is, as long as it's looked upon as especially unique, then perhaps it carries a special stain upon everyone involved, rather than being part of something that's much larger, and therefore, because it gets blended into all of the societies, either faster or slower, and that's another stain, and another issue. But perhaps it's more helpful to look at it in the context of all slavery.
I think it is helpful to see Unite American Slavery, and I keep on saying slavery in the Americas, right, as part of a variant of a kind of historical way in which slavery developed in the world. But I think that there is something what I like to call historical specificities. Because if you see slavery in the Americas as, okay, part of the variant of the world, of slavery in the world, then you have to say to yourself, oh, okay, all right, well, everybody had it, so, what's the problem? What's the problem? Why I want to talk about a sort of uniqueness is that we don't know of anywhere else, and, history is a long arc, so somebody may find something 5,000 years, from about 5,000 years from now. But that we don't know of anywhere else in the modern world in which slavery was based not on religion, not on debt bondage, which is what it was based on before that, i.e. you owed money, so, people put you as a slave. But that it was really that your skin color became a badge and a marker of slavery. And it is that business of skin color becoming a badge and mark of slavery that then constructs theories of inferiority. Not of human beings, but of an inferiority of a black person, which then creates what some people call anti-black racism, which is a result of slavery, racial slavery in this country and in the Americas. That then means that the legacies, and I don't like the word so much, but the deposits that were then created and that follow us today and shapes us, then creates a certain kind of society. This is what, so in other words, to be able to think about the questions of uniqueness of the slavery in the Americas and the way in which race functioned in that system, social system of slavery, then allows us in the present to begin to think about the questions of racism in the society. This is the point. So it is not even the question. It's not even by just looking backward and saying, oh well, this is what we need to do to understand, to talk about the present. It is by understanding the history of the thing and its complexities and the role that race played that then may allow us to begin to understand the questions of how the black population is marginalized. And it also then does something which is very important, which I tried to make in the talk. It also begins to identify anti-black racism not just as something of individual prejudice, that, okay, I have individual prejudice and, let me get rid of it and so on. But to understand anti-black racism as something that is systemic, that is in the structures of the society. I would draw your attention to the report of the Justice Department of United States on their investigation of the Ferguson police force, where they state absolutely clearly, and here I'm paraphrasing them, that the ways in which the police force in Ferguson operated is that they operated in racial categories. Now, you don't operate in racial categories unless you have a society that is constructed around those questions. So for me, therefore, the questions of uniqueness, and I always put uniqueness in quotation marks, right? But in this talk, what I want to do is to think about uniqueness as a kind of historical specificity, and how that historical specificity plays out in the present, by creating certain structures and conditions. Yes, Professor Bogues.
I think one of the ways that we can think about it is by looking at comparative slavery in the Americas. Because what what you see in the Americas is a variance of a system, which help to point to the underlying commonalities as much as the variants are extraordinarily interesting in their own right. So I think, for instance, if you look at, say at one end, American slavery, which develops actually the largest slave breeding tradition, in which the internal market for slaves becomes critical. You have the one-drop rule, because you can't escape from the market. You're identified as a certain kind of commodity, and therefore you can't have an escape from the market. As in comparison, say for example, to Caribbean slavery, in which you have the intermediate class, the mulattoes, even being allowed under the Code Noir in French Caribbean slavery to escape somewhat to own property, albeit holding a different status. The commonality is that at one end, and in all systems, race is defined that black people cannot escape from the net. But the differentiation suggests, certainly in my reading of it, that it both suggests the saliency of race and how different societies use that saliency depending on the sorts of economic conditions which prevail in those societies. Yeah. But it certainly helps to give resonance to the notion that racial slavery, as developed in the Americas, from right down to Argentina, had a uniqueness about it, but at the same time a variation which underlined the uniqueness.
Yeah. Yes, Jordan.
Thank you so much for the inspired lecture. I guess the question is, if you could say a little bit more about Du Bois. You make this, I think, elegant phrase that historical knowledge is a form of reasoning that attempts to rationalize the present. But then you use Du Bois as a kind of counterpoint to that framing of history. And I think that you're suggesting that his offers also a kind of historical knowledge connected to the present. So if you maybe would differentiate between the kind of historical knowledge offered by Black Reconstruction in the 30s.
Yeah, in the talk I actually elaborate on it, but I was also very careful of time. I did not want to go over 30 minutes, and I stopped exactly at 30 so that we could have time for discussion. Because what I try to work through in the talk is this, is that if there's a form of history, which is, bear in mind now, history is about knowledge of the past. History, there's a way in which we think history and the past are the same things, right? And I want to suggest that we need to have a distinction in our minds that history is really about the knowledge of the past. If history is really, as I said, about a certain kind of rationalization of the past that in its relationship to the present, then I would want to suggest to you that what Du Bois is doing is actually, yes, working in the present and trying to think about the past, but he's doing what I like to call critical history, right? Or sometimes what I call effective history. That is a way in which you are thinking about the past, and you're thinking about the present, and you're thinking about the relationship, because you cannot help but do that, because you live in the present and you have an historical imagination that's trying to think, reconstruct, if you wish, or interpret the past. But you are doing so critically because you are trying to think about the ways in which the society today needs actual change. You see that, so that there's a criticality to that history, because what you're then trying to say is, okay, how can I think through the way in which, say, slavery was, or racial slavery was established, in the way in which Reconstruction happened, the way in which black folks attempted to do certain things, and what are the ways in which today the society needs to actually change, and what are the kind of, if you wish, the kind of categories that I can begin to think about this sort of thing. If you're doing the other kind of history where you're talking about also rationalization of the past, then what you're doing is not interested in change. What you're trying to say is that it is what it is. Right? And so that, I'm sorry, this is bad judgment, etc. But no. Critical history, in my view, or effective history, is about a certain kind of critical interpretation of the past. And it is also, and this is what some of my historian friends argue with me about, and say I'm a philosopher, not a historian. That's true. I don't never study history, but for me, history, you can't think about thought and philosophy and theory without not thinking about history, in my view. That this thing has to be grounded in history. Because history is also about the human experience of the species, right? In a lot of ways, and it's about a certain temporality in relationship to that. But one of the things that I think that is important is to then think that all of us, when we do historical work, bring to the table the reading of the archive and so on, no matter what the archive is, a certain historical imagination. The discipline of history evolves and breaks from a certain literary thing and a certain narrative because people felt that it really shouldn't be about poems and so on and so forth, but should be about certain kind of facts and certain things that happen. So we use a historical imagination when we look at the archive. My point is, how do you interpret that archive? What do you bring? Everybody brings something to that archive. You just don't go inside there and archive there and so on. Right? Even when some of us say the archive speaks to us, the archive only speaks to us when already we are thinking about certain things. It cannot speak in a language that we don't have in our heads or in a set of questions that we do not have. And therefore, the question of the historical imagination, in my view, is really then about a certain kind of critical historical imagination. Something that is able to allow us to look at the archives, to perhaps read against the grain of the archives, to perhaps find another set of archives and so on to begin to think to begin to think about. So let me give you one example. People say the African American loves to sing. The Boys in Souls of Black Folks has a chapter called the Sorrow Songs, in which he talks about the gifts of African Americans to America, and one of these gifts is these songs. What if we critically began to think about those songs as an archive in which the African American was beginning to elaborate a set of ideas about him or herself in relationship to the conditions of his or her life? In other words, it's not just a gift, but that is a way it is a set of materials in which it may be useful to begin to think with in terms of trying to get the ideas of the people who were enslaved. That to me means a different kind of way to begin to think about some of the histories that we have, and therefore allows us to have a certain kind of historical imagination that is more critical. Does that make sense to you, Jordan? Okay. Sorry, I haven't got my watch on, but I'm being given the signal. Do I wrap? All right, so can I thank you all very, very much for this?